Most governments collapse the moment their army collapses. Rome didn't. And that's the part that I want to sit with for just a second. In 216 BC, at the place called Cannae, Rome lost something like 50,000 men in a single afternoon, along with 80 senators, one of the two sitting consuls, and both of that year's quaestors, all gone in a space of a few hours. Any monarchy in that position sues for peace. A dictatorship reorganizes. A modern government panics and starts looking for the exits. Rome refused to even send an ambassador. Instead, they elected new magistrates. They raised new legions. And some of those legions were made up of the slaves who'd been promised their freedom for fighting. The assemblies kept meeting. The tribunes kept using their veto. And the whole thing just kept running. And the reason it kept running comes down to how it was built. No single man's failure could break it, because every office had a backup, and every person in it could be replaced. Toughness had nothing to do with it. So the Roman Republic wasn't a democracy, at least not in the way that we use the word. It was closer to a machine built specifically to survive collapse. And the strange thing, the thing that the whole series is really about, is that the machine collapsed anyway, and it didn't go away all at once. The layers wore down one at a time, quietly, until there was nothing left holding the thing up. The same pattern is running somewhere in the world right now, while you're watching this. But there's a problem with only ever watching the death. You don't understand how the system was actually built. You can't really understand how it broke. Before you can run a civilizational autopsy, you have to know what was alive in the first place. So this series works the other direction. It's a full dissection of the Roman Republic, not the dramatic set pieces, not Caesar crossing the Rubicon or Pompey and Crassus carving up the world between them. Those come later, and they'll make a lot more sense once you understand the machine that those men were taking apart. The Republic ran for nearly 500 years, and a run like that is engineering, not luck. So today we take the machine apart layer by layer, because when it fails in very specific ways. And those specific ways are the ones that you've seen before. So let me start with what the Republic was not, because most of what people think they know about it is just wrong. The first thing is that it was not a democracy, not in any sense that maps onto what we mean today. The word comes from the Latin res publica, which just means the public thing. The idea is the state belongs to everybody rather than to one man, and that's a very different claim from saying everybody governs. Mary Beard makes this point very well in SPQR. Res publica meant the state was public property, everyone's shared business, which is not at all the same thing as everyone getting an equal say. In the actual Roman voting system, the wealthiest citizens could outvote the entire poor population, legally, and it was by design. The Republic was built to stop the will of one man from ever becoming permanent law. Expressing the will of the people was never really the goal, and those two are completely different projects. The second thing, SPQR wasn't a slogan. Senatus Populosque Romanus, the Senate and people of Rome. It went on the military standards, the public buildings, the official correspondence. And it pointed to two sources of authority at once, the Senate and the people, held in permanent and deliberate tension. The tension wasn't decorative. It was a fault line running straight through every decision that Rome ever made. And we'll keep coming back to it in every episode. The third thing, and this is the one that people really get backwards, the Senate didn't pass laws. It couldn't legislate directly at all. Laws came out of the assemblies. What the Senate issued were decrees, technically just advisory. And a magistrate, in theory, could ignore one without breaking any written law. What the Senate actually controlled was everything else. The money, the provinces, foreign policy, who got which military command, and basically the entire administrative apparatus of the Mediterranean Empire. And that gap, the space between where the formal power sat and where the real power sat, is exactly where the Republic's fragility was hiding. So let's talk about the assemblies, because that's where laws really got made. There were three main ones, and the one most people are taught is that the Senate made the decisions, which isn't actually how it worked. The top-tier assembly was called the Comitia Centuriata. It elected the senior magistrates, the consuls and praetors and censors. It voted on declarations of war. It ratified or rejected peace treaties. And it handled the big constitutional changes. And here's the detail that changes how you see the whole thing. It was organized by wealth. It was divided into 193 voting units called centuries. And the top 2 property classes controlled 98 of those, while everyone else, the vast majority of Roman citizens, shared the remaining 95. To carry a vote, you needed 97 centuries, a bare majority, which means the wealthy could win outright before the lower classes ever got a turn. Voting started at the top and stopped the instant you hit 97, so the poor very often never got to vote at all. And this was the original design, not some later corruption of it. The Centuriata was partly a military assembly, so the men who paid for their own legionary equipment, who carried the financial weight of going to war, got proportionately more say. And the logic actually makes sense back in 509 BC, when Rome was a small city hemmed in by hostile neighbors. It turned into a liability once conquest shifted the balance of power, and once the vote became something that you could just buy. The money problem really starts right there. Then you've got the Comitia Tributa, the tribal assembly, which elected the lower magistrates and handled most of the everyday legislation. It was organized by tribe rather than wealth class, but the rural tribes had more voting units than the urban ones, and the wealthy landowners tended to dominate those rural tribes. So still, it was tilted toward property. And finally, there's the Concilium Plebis, the plebeian council. After 287 BC, laws passed by that body became binding on every Roman, patricians included. That was the real payoff of about 2 centuries of plebeian struggle, and what they'd won wasn't as much a new system, so much as access to the one that already existed. The plebs never really wanted to tear down the republic. They wanted a seat inside of it. And that distinction matters, because later on, when the ambitious men start using the plebeian assemblies as weapons, they aren't inventing something new. They're pushing on a door that had always been left slightly open. One rule tied all 3 assemblies together, and it's easy to miss. None of them could convene on their own. A magistrate had to call them, set the agenda, and run the session. And people voted yes or no on whatever was put in front of them, with no debate, no amendments, no alternatives on the table. So that's what Roman popular participation actually looked like. It was legitimate but tightly controlled, real but channeled, and it always depended on somebody in the magistrate class deciding to call the assembly in the first place. The people had a voice, but they couldn't speak without permission. Now the Senate, which is really the center of gravity in all of this. On paper, it had no legislative power. It couldn't pass laws. It couldn't issue those decrees, the senatus consultum, and a magistrate could technically defy one without breaking any statute. And yet the Senate effectively ran Rome for 400 years. So how does that work? It comes down to 2 things, auctoritas and money. Auctoritas doesn't translate cleanly. Authority gets close, but it misses something. What it really means is moral weight, the accumulated credibility of men who actually had run the state. The senators were the former consuls, and the praetors and the censors of Rome, men who'd governed distant provinces, commanded armies in the field, sat across the table from foreign kings. So when they handed down a collective judgment, it landed hard, not because of any legal force behind it, but because of who they were. Ignoring the Senate wasn't illegal, it just wasn't done. And that phrase, not done, is going to keep coming up all series, because it might be the single most important idea in Roman constitutional history. The moment not done stops being true, everything changes. The second source of Senate power was the treasury. The aerarium, the state treasury, sat under the Senate oversight, and so did the provincial assignments, military funding, the grain supply contracts. A magistrate who defied a Senate decree could suddenly find his budget frozen, his command not renewed, his supply lines quietly cut, his career effectively finished. You don't need legal authority when you control the money. This is the Republic's first and most persistent fault line. Control the money, and the legal structure almost stops mattering. Lose control of it, whether through conquest wealth, pouring into private hands, or the wholesale bribing of assemblies, or generals financing their own campaigns off provincial plunder, and the Senate's real power just evaporates. The Senate itself started at 300 members, later pushed up to 600 under Sulla, and then 900 under Caesar. Membership was for life, unless the censors threw you out for some moral failing. And you got in by holding a magistracy, and any magistracy at all. So it was essentially a permanent council of men who had already proven themselves inside the system, which gave it real institutional memory and a deep pool of shared experience. It also created a very powerful gap of men with a very strong personal interest in keeping the structure exactly as it was. That conservatism worked in Rome's favor for 3 centuries, right up until it became the thing that couldn't move fast enough once the pressures changed. Then you have the consuls, which is where the paranoia in this system really shows. 2 of them, elected every year, both holding full executive power at the same time. Think about what that actually means day to day. 2 men with identical authority, 1-year terms, and each one with the legal right to veto the other at any moment. So neither could act alone on anything that mattered. That wasn't inefficiency. It was deliberate paranoia written straight into the Constitution. Remember, the Romans had thrown out their last king around 509 BC, Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud. And after that expulsion, one idea became the organizing fear of the Roman political life: regnum, kingship. Accusing a man of reaching for regnum wasn't just a political jab. It was a charge that could get him killed. And several prominent Romans were killed in the early centuries on exactly that accusation. Whether it was even true barely mattered. The fear of it shaped everything. So when they designed the consulship, they engineered against regnum at every level. 2 men instead of 1, so neither could act alone. Annual terms, so nobody held power long enough to dig in. A mandatory 10-year gap before you could hold it again, so ambition couldn't build on itself. And that full mutual veto, so neither consul could govern without at least the quiet cooperation of the other. They even alternated command of the army month by month, and took turns presiding over the Senate, so that even their symbolic authority was split up across the time. Each consul went around in public preceded by 12 lictors, carrying the fasces, those bundles of rods. Outside the city, an axe went into the bundle, standing for the power over life and death. But inside the walls, inside the Palmarium, Rome's sacred boundary, the axe came out, because military power stopped at the city gates. By ritual, by tradition, and by sheer weight of the mos maiorum. The line between armed power and civic space wasn't only symbolic. It was the guarantee that the man commanding the army couldn't also command the city. The day somebody finally ignores that line is the whole episode of its own, and it's coming. Now the tribunes of the plebs, which might be the most deliberately engineered piece of the entire system. They were built for a single job, and that job was to stop things rather than to build or to govern. 10 tribunes elected by the plebeian council, 1-year terms, and they held 2 powers that existed nowhere else in the Constitution. The first was personal sacrosanctity. A tribune's body was literally untouchable under Roman law. So if you physically harmed one, if you arrested him or blocked him or laid a hand on him, any Roman citizen could kill you for it. No trial required. No magistrate needed to sign off. The killing was simply legal. And this wasn't a metaphor. This was the actual enforceable protection standing behind the people's representatives, with the people themselves as the ones who enforced it. The second power was intercessio, the veto. A tribune could stop any action by any magistrate anywhere in Rome, any Senate session, any assembly vote, any arrest, any conscription order. He just had to say the word, and no explanation was required, and no process for overriding him. He could simply walk into a room, say no, and the entire apparatus of the Roman state ground to a halt. But look at the constraint the Romans built in on the purpose. The tribune's power was purely defensive. He could stop things. But he couldn't fund an army, couldn't assign a province, couldn't touch the treasury, couldn't summon the senior assemblies. All he could do was block. And they knew exactly what they were doing there. Because a weapon that could both block and build would sooner or later get used to concentrate power in whoever was holding it. So they cut off the building half and left him with pure blockage, pure negation. And it held for nearly 300 years. right up until somebody realized you can take a system apart using nothing but negative power. You don't have to build a replacement, you just have to keep blocking the existing structure until it collapses under its own contradictions. That story lands in 133 BC, and the name attached to it is Tiberius Gracchus. Before we get there, we need to understand how Rome made sure the right people reached power in the first place. That's the cursus honorum, the course of honors, the fixed sequence of offices that every Roman politician had to climb, with no skipping, no shortcuts, and no men handed too much power too early. The order ran quaestor first, then either aedile or tribune of the plebs, then praetor, then consul, and each rung came with a minimum age. You couldn't stand for quaestor until you were 30. Praetor sat somewhere around 39, and the consulship stayed close to you until at least 42, with a mandatory gap of at least 2 years between the offices. And before you could even hold the quaestorship, you were expected to have put in 10 years of military service. So by the time a man reached consulship, he'd spent 15 to 20 years inside the machinery of the state. He managed accounts in the treasury, ran the markets, and the public games as an aedile, presided over courts as a praetor, governed a minor province, commanded troops. He arrived with a track record that the whole Senate could weigh, with allies and enemies, and a reputation he couldn't torch without torching himself. The whole ladder worked as a filter, keeping ambitious young men away from real power until they were old enough to grasp what it costs to use it badly, or old enough to have too much invested in the system to want to burn it down. That's the theory, anyway. The slow crack in it came with the rewards of conquest, made following the rules start to look like a bad trade. Once the consulship wasn't just a title, but the key to an enormous provincial command worth millions in tribute or plunder, waiting 15 years for it started to feel like leaving money on the table. The ladder didn't exactly break. It just turned into something ambitious men wanted to climb a lot faster, and a few of them worked out how. And then there's a layer that matters the most and breaks the easiest at the same time, which is the mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors. It was never written down, never a law, never enforceable in any Roman court, and yet it carried more binding force than written law did, which means that once the custom eroded, the Constitution followed it down. Every Roman politician knew what was acceptable and what crossed a line, and what quietly would end a career, what would bring the informal weight of the Senate down on you, and what could get you exiled, what could get you killed, not through the courts, but through the withdrawal of whole social and political network that made Roman public life possible. Take a few examples. A general wasn't supposed to bring his army inside the Palmarium, which appears nowhere in any constitution. It was just not done. A consul wasn't supposed to seek re-election until a full 10 years had passed. And yes, that one was written in law, but the informal weight behind it ran deeper than the statute ever did. A dictator was expected to lay the office down the moment his task was finished, not at the 6-month mark, but the day the crisis ended. A tribune wasn't supposed to veto ordinary Senate business over some personal grudge. The veto was there to shield ordinary citizens from arbitrary magistrates, and using it in any other way, while never technically illegal, was simply not done. Mos maiorum held together for 2 reasons. The first is that everyone who mattered had the same formation, the same schools, the same text, the same handful of stories about men like Cincinnatus and Camillus and Fabius Maximus. They all carried the same picture of what Roman virtue looked like, and not as an abstraction, but as specific men who had made specific choices. And the second reason is that the informal enforcement was genuinely real. Social exclusion, a destroyed career, public shame in front of thousands of citizens, and the actual worst-case violence, authorized by the Senate's emergency decree, the Senatus Consultum Ultimum. But here's the fragility hiding in all of it. Mos maiorum assumed a fairly stable elite that shared values and shared formation, that everyone competing for power had internalized the same unwritten code. And as Rome expanded, that assumption quietly started to fail. New men came into politics from outside the old aristocracy, men with strong military records but no senatorial family, and no ancestral connection to the old rules. Generals who spent years on campaign far from Rome, discovered their armies were more loyal to them personally than to the republic they were supposed to be serving. And a whole generation grew up watching the rules get broken, and the men who broke them get rewarded. Once you've watched someone break the rule and win, the rule is already half dead. And that's a human problem, not a specifically Roman one. Rome also had something like a constitutional kill switch, and it was legal, deliberate, and carefully bounded. They called it the dictatorship. In a real emergency, an invasion, a military catastrophe, a total breakdown of civic order, a consul would appoint a dictator on the Senate's recommendation. And once appointed, that man held absolute imperium, with no colleague, no veto over him, no appeals process. One man with total authority. But it came wrapped in 3 constraints. 6 months maximum, with the office expiring automatically, no matter what was still going on. Public funds unusable for only the emergency itself. And by the force of mos maiorum, the unwritten constitution again, the dictator was expected to step down the instant the crisis passed. Not when 6 months ran out, but the day it was over. The classic example is Cincinnatus. In 458 BC, with Rome facing military disaster and a Roman army trapped by the Aequi, the Senate records send messengers across the Tiber to his farm, and they find him out plowing. He puts down the plow, puts on his toga, and takes the appointment. He organizes the rescue, the enemy surrenders, and 16 days later, he resigns the dictatorship and walks back to his farm. Now, that's Livy's telling. And Livy is the first to admit that Rome's earliest stories are half legend, polished up over centuries of retelling. But the Romans treated it as gospel. By his account, Cincinnatus laid the office down on the 16th day and went home. And they kept telling that story for 400 years, in their schools, and on the floor of the Senate, holding it up as the model of Roman virtue. And they told it constantly for a reason, because the entire logic of the dictatorship depended on it, staying true. The kill switch could only exist as long as every man handled total power, would voluntarily give it back. Take that assumption away, and the 6-month limit means nothing. The Senate's recommendation becomes a formality, and the kill switch turns into the ignition. The day Sulla became dictator for an indefinite term, with no 6-month clock, and no emergency to bound it. The story about Cincinnatus stopped being an operating principle and became a nostalgic myth. But we're not there yet. Everything I've described so far, the assemblies and the Senate and the consuls and the tribunes, that's the formal structure. And it was real and it mattered. But it still doesn't tell you how Roman politics actually ran day to day. For that, you need patron-client networks, which is the visible layer underneath everything. The one thing that quietly ran the whole show and eventually corroded it from the inside. Every wealthy Roman, every senator, every magistrate had clients, sometimes hundreds, sometimes thousands. The relationship was called amicita, friendship, though no friendship the way that we'd mean it. It was structured exchange, binding in public, governed by its own unwritten rules. The patrons supplied things: legal representation in court, financial backing when times got hard, political endorsement at election time, physical protection if it came to that, job referrals, access to his whole social world. And the client paid it back in votes, in physical labor, in public shows of support, in showing up at ceremonies, in visible daily loyalty. Every morning, a wealthy Roman's doorway filled up with clients arriving for salutio, the morning greeting. And the number of them standing at your door was a public measure of your power, something all of Rome could literally count. That network ran the actual republic. How did laws get through assemblies? A senator moved his clients into the voting centuries. How did elections work? Candidates walked the streets surrounded by their clients, a walking display of organized support. How did the courts function? A defendant needed patrons willing to vouch for his character. The formal institutions were real, but the energy moving through them came through these informal webs of obligation and loyalty. And here's where it turns into a structural problem, because that loyalty was personal. You were loyal to your patron, not Rome, not to the Senate, not to the Republic as some abstract thing, but to the specific man whose help you depended on. And as long as powerful patrons were themselves committed to the Republic's norms, the network reinforced the system, with the informal layer and the formal layer pulling in the same direction. But the moment a patron got powerful enough and rich enough To put his own interests ahead of the Republic's, his clients went with him, not the Republic, with him. That's the point where the invisible layer stops holding the structure up and starts tearing it apart from the inside. We're going to watch exactly how that plays out in names you already know: Sulla, Pompey, Caesar. But not yet. First, we have to understand what was actually lost when it broke. So go back to 216 BC, back to Cannae. 50,000 Romans dead in one afternoon. 80 senators, one of the consuls, both quaestors, 29 military tribunes, all of them gone. Any monarchy collapses after a blow like that. Any dictatorship sits down and negotiates. And Rome just kept fighting, because no one person's failure could break the system. Polybius, a Greek writing about a century later, but with access to men who still remembered the war, argued exactly this: that it was Rome's mixed constitution, all those competing checks pulling against each other, that let the city take a hit like Cannae and still stay on its feet. He pointed to the recovery itself as proof that the design worked. And it's worth walking through what actually happened inside Rome in the days after. The surviving consul, Varro, whom plenty of people blame for the whole disaster, came back to the city, and the Senate went out to meet him at the gates. And they thanked him, not for winning, obviously, but for not despairing for the Republic. That's a precise phrase, and Livy preserves the actual language. The crowds and senators came out to meet Varro and thanked him, quote, because he had not despaired of the Republic, end quote. A defeated general, and they lined up to thank him for not giving up on the system. They didn't care much that he'd lost. They cared that he'd held the constitutional posture that kept Rome recoverable. So new senators were enrolled to replace the dead. New legions were raised. Some of them out of slaves offered their freedom. The assemblies kept meeting. The tribunes kept their veto alive. The treasury kept working. And new magistrates got elected right on normal schedule. The genius of the Republic was that when one layer failed, 3 others held it up. The tragedy is that eventually all the layers weakened at the same time. Think of the whole thing as an arch, where every stone holds the others in place, and no single stone carries the entire load. Pull 1, and the arch redistributes the weight. Pull 3, and it still stands. Pull 5 in the right places, in the right order, and the whole thing comes down. Rome spent about 100 years finding out exactly which stones those were, and pulling them out one at a time, each time assuming the arch would hold. Here's what the textbooks tend to skip over. Every strength in this system carried a matching weakness, and it carried that weakness because of the design, not in spite of it. The Republic died because its own redundancies stopped being redundant. Nobody conquered it. 3 specific pressures broke all 3 layers. The first is money. Conquest flooded Rome with wealth, and that wealth couldn't possibly land evenly. So senatorial families used their political positions to grab provincial contracts, tax collection rights, and huge agricultural estates. The gap between the richest Romans and everyone else grew enormous, and faster than any earlier generation had ever watched it grow. And that gap changed what political participation cost. To run for consul, now you had to fund public games, bribe the tribal voters, keep hundreds of clients fed at your own expense, host the feasts, put up the monuments. The patron-client network scaled directly with personal wealth. So more money meant more clients meant more votes. More votes meant more power, and more power meant access to still more provincial wealth. Nobody designed that feedback loop. It emerged out of the collision between conquest and patron-client structure, and it slowly turned every election into a conquest of resources rather than merit. That's the money fault line switching on. The second pressure is displacement. Conquest also brought hundreds of thousands of slaves back from the conquered territories, and they got put to work on the big agricultural estates, the latifundia, owned by senators and wealthy equestrians. Small Roman farmers couldn't compete with slave labor, so they went bankrupt, sold their land, and drifted into Rome, where they became the urban poor, and they became available clients and available votes for anyone who could feed and support them. And crucially, they were no longer in the legions, because the army still required you to own your own property to enroll. Empty the Italian countryside of small farmers, and you've emptied the legions of their traditional recruiting base, which created a genuine manpower crisis. A general named Gaius Marius is usually credited with solving it, about a generation on from where we are now, by opening enrollment to landless citizens around 107 BC, though historians increasingly read that shift as a gradual thing rather than one clean stroke of reform. Either way, the effect was the same. Militarily, it worked brilliantly, but those soldiers had no land waiting for them, no ancestral farm, no independent footing of their own. So their retirement and their future rested entirely on their general, not on Rome, and not on the Senate, but on the man who recruited them and who would presumably get them their pensions. That's the borders fault line, the demographic collapse of the countryside, feeding straight into the power fault line. The third pressure is extended command. The Republic was designed for a city-state running a few hundred miles of Italian territory, so a consular command was supposed to last one campaign season, a single year. The consul went out, won, came home, celebrated a triumph, and went back to civilian life. But governing Spain doesn't fit into a one-year rotation. Pacifying Macedon takes continuity, and the Punic Wars dragged on for decades. So the Senate started extending commands. One more year, then another, then another. Formally, these extensions just kept the man on as a pro-magistrate, a pro-consul, or a pro-praetor, still technically answering to the Senate. In practice, a general who spent 6 years in Hispania, with 4 veteran legions loyal to him personally, was not really a subordinate magistrate anymore. He was an independent military power, and the cursus honorum had no way to pull him back in. Most maiorum told him to come home, and that worked right up until the men in question decided the informal rule no longer applied to them. None of this broke all at once. It bent, over roughly a century. One generation of politicians watched a norm get violated and imposed no real consequence. The next generation treated that violation as an acceptable precedent, and the generation after that broke the new floor. Each step looked manageable on its own. Each exception got justified by the circumstances, and each precedent quietly became the new baseline, a little lower than the one before, until the Senate looked up one day and the entire informal substructure was simply gone. The mos maiorum, the shared custom that had held all of it together, had been wearing away for 100 years. The formal law was still sitting right there on the books, but the thing that had made the law mean anything, the informal enforcement behind it, was already dead. The visible structure was a shell by then, and there were men with armies standing outside the gates. Modern governments run on the same kind of layers: separation of powers, independent courts, a free press, a professional civil service, federalism. And underneath all of that, the informal norms, the unwritten expectations about how office holders behave, how elections get contested, how power actually transfers. Those norms are the mos maiorum of modern governance. When any single layer fails, the others compensate. And that's why complex political systems hold up so well under ordinary pressure. The failure mode is almost never a sudden collapse. It's the slow wearing away of the layers that nobody happens to be watching. Norms rot before law breaks. Informal understandings dissolve before the formal institutions fail. And by the time visible structure finally cracks, the invisible part underneath it has been gone for years. So the whole thing worth watching for is the layers you can't see, the ones nobody's paying attention to. It's less a story about what always happens to democracies, and more a question of where to actually look. This series is going to trace that 100-year collapse layer by layer, working through the moving parts underneath the story, rather than the great men sitting on top of it. And every episode will show you one layer failing, and every failure showing up as pressure on the money, the borders, and the power. The Gracchi come first in 133 BC. A tribune named Tiberius Gracchus looks at the emptied-out Italian countryside, at the slave estates, at the mass of landless poor crowding into Rome, and he concludes that the Republic's founding promise, a citizen body of independent small landowners, has been quietly destroyed. So he decides to use the tribune's power, that purely defensive, purely negative weapon, to force through radical land reform. And he was right about the problem, and honestly, he was probably right about the solution too. It was the way he went about it that something broke. He bypassed the Senate completely and went straight to the plebeian council. And he deposed a fellow tribune who tried to veto him, which had never been done before. A Senate that had never once had to enforce its unwritten rules through direct violence suddenly found that it had to. Up on the Capitol, senators and their followers snapped the legs and boards out of the benches and beat Tiberius Gracchus and his supporters to death, then threw the bodies into the Tiber. Plutarch describes the scene in gory detail. The improvised clubs, the killing carried out by senators with their own hands, just feet from the temple. And when you kill a sitting tribune, when you cross that particular line, mos maiorum doesn't just bend, it breaks. And once it's broken, every actor who comes after has proof that the rules don't apply when the stakes are high enough. And that proof changes everything downstream from it. The Marian reforms, the social war, Sulla marching on Rome, the first triumvirate, the second, Caesar. Every step follows the one before it. Every precedent clears the way for the next violation. Every exception hardens into the new normal. You don't actually need a tyrant to end a republic. You just need enough people to quietly stop believing the rules apply to them. You've seen that before. You're watching it right now. This has been The Roman Pattern. I'm Jeremy Ryan Slate. Please like this video, leave us a comment, and smash that subscribe button if you want more of The Roman Pattern.